There is a tree in the Yucatecan jungle that peels itself alive every day of its existence, and the Mayans placed it at the corner of the world. Not just any corner, at the heart of their cosmology, at that point where time and space intersect. The H-men, the ritual specialists and healers of the Maya people, placed 4 trees that held up the universe. 4 trees that separated chaos from order. 4 trees without which, according to that vision of the cosmos we now call mythology, and which they simply called reality, the sky would fall to earth. And one of those 4 trees, the one with red bark that peels off in thin sheets like old paper, has just caught the attention of researchers at the Center for Research and Advanced Studies of the National Polytechnic Institute, because its terpenoid compounds show, under laboratory conditions, a capacity to protect neurons that no currently available synthetic drug can replicate with the same safety profile. That's not mysticism. It's biochemistry. And the distance between the H-men who applied the resin of that tree to the back of a fisherman with chronic pain on the coast of Campeche 500 years ago, and the researcher who today measures the inhibition of acetylcholinesterase in a sample of nerve tissue in a laboratory in Mexico City, is shorter than either of them would be comfortable admitting. But to understand what the Chaca is and why it matters, we first need to understand the 4 trees. Because the story of this tree doesn't begin in a laboratory, it begins at the beginning of the world. Mayan cosmology was not mere cultural decoration, it was a system for organizing knowledge. The classic Maya, those who built Palenque, Chichen Itza, Calakmul, and Uxmal, those who developed the most accurate calendar of their time before the technology existed to calculate it by means other than systematic observation over generations, divided the universe into 4 sectors, each associated with a color, a wind, a tree, and a type of rain. The north was white, the south was yellow, the east was red, the west was black, and at each of these cardinal points, holding the sky above the earth, stood a specific cosmic tree. The ceiba tree, which the Maya called yakshe, meaning green tree or turquoise tree, was the central tree. The ceiba is the world tree, the Maya axis mundi, the axis that connects the underworld with the surface and the sky. But the 4 trees of the cardinal directions were not ceibas. They were different trees, chosen with a precision that was not arbitrary. And this choice, which for centuries ethnobotanists interpreted as metaphor, turns out to have had a practical logic as well as a symbolic one. The tree of the east, the direction of the rising sun, the most charged with vital energy in Mayan cosmology, was the Chaca, which botanists call Bursera simaruba, and which in Caribbean English is known as gumbo limbo, although that name tells us almost nothing about what the tree is. In Spanish, we also call it copal chino in some parts of Mexico, or indio desnudo in areas of the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, for reasons that will become clear in a moment. The tree of the north, according to various colonial texts and ethnobotanical records documented in the 20th century, was the copal, Bursera bipinnata or Bursera odorata, depending on the region, the tree whose fragrant resin has been burned in Mesoamerican rituals since long before the Aztecs arrived in the Valley of Mexico, and which shares a botanical family with the Chaca. The tree of the south was the ramon, Brosimum alicastrum, whose nutritious seed sustained Mayan cities during times of drought, and which today the United Nations Development Program recognizes as one of the crops with the greatest potential for food security in southeastern Mexico and Central America. And the tree of the west, the direction of sunset and the dead, was the tzalam, Lysiloma laticiliquum, whose iron-hard wood was one of the most important building materials in classic Mayan architecture. 4 trees, 4 points in space, 4 types of ecological knowledge accumulated over centuries of systematic observation, encoded in a symbolic system that allowed it to be transmitted from generation to generation without the need for alphabetic writing. This is pre-scientific science. Incomplete, yes, mixed with religious worldview, yes, but science nonetheless, based on empirical data collected for longer than Western pharmacology has existed as a discipline. And the most extraordinary of the 4, at least from the perspective of modern neuroscience, was the eastern tree, the one that peels. The chaca is a tree that anyone who has walked through the tropical dry forests of southeastern Mexico, the ones that cover most of the Yucatan Peninsula, northern Campeche, the coast of Quintana Roo, parts of Belize, and northern Guatemala, will have noticed immediately, even if they didn't know what it was. It's impossible not to notice it. The outer bark of the chaca is a coppery red or burnt orange that glows in the midday light, as if the tree were ablaze from within. That bark continually peels away in thin, translucent sheets that fall to the ground around the tree like worn tissue paper. Beneath it, the new bark is green and smooth. And that image, the tree that is constantly undressing, shedding its outer layer to reveal something fresher and more alive underneath, was for the Maya the perfect image of time itself. Constant renewal, the cycle that never stops, the skin of the world that is renewed with each season. That is why the chaca tree was associated with the East, with dawn, with the beginning of cycles. It was not an arbitrary association. The Mayan H-men were observers of natural phenomena with a depth that 20th-century anthropology took decades to recognize. When a 17th-century H-man in the Izamal region chose the chaca tree for the direction of the rising sun, he was not acting on poetic fancy. He was encoding in a system of collective memory something he had observed and verified for generations. That this tree, specifically this tree, had properties that made sense in the category of what is reborn, what regenerates, what begins again. And the properties that make sense in that category, when one looks for them in the chemical composition of Bursera simaruba, are not decorative. But before we get to that, we need to consider how this tree was used in actual Mayan medicine. Not the ceremonial version found in cultural tourism books. I mean the everyday medicine that served the fishermen of Sisal, the corn farmers of Valladolid, and the midwives of Tizimin when someone had a problem we would now call neuropathy, chronic pain, or limb weakness. The 16th and 17th century colonial texts that documented Mayan medicine, and which survived the massive destruction of knowledge represented by the burning of Mayan codices ordered by Friar Diego de Landa in Mani in 1562, when in a single act of religious zeal, dozens of books containing centuries of astronomical, medical, and botanical knowledge were destroyed, describe chaca with a consistency that cannot be accidental. The tree's resin, applied directly to the skin, was used to relieve persistent pains that did not respond to other treatments. The fresh bark, grated and dissolved in water, was taken as a decoction for what the colonial texts described as tremors of the hands and feet and for weakness of the limbs that cannot support the body. The oil that exudes from the new bark, that transparent and slightly aromatic liquid that appears when an incision is made in the tree, was mixed with other resins and animal fats to make ointments that the H-men applied to the spine of people with partial paralysis. These descriptions, read with the vocabulary of contemporary neurology, are not vague. They are extraordinarily specific. Tremors in the hands and feet are symptoms of peripheral neuropathy. Weakness in limbs that cannot support the body is the preclinical language of muscular atrophy of neurological origin. The application of oils to the spine to treat partial paralysis points directly to the central nervous system as the target of treatment. The Mayan H-men did not have the vocabulary of neurology, but they had the patience, they had observation, and they had the tree. The use of chaca was not limited to the Yucatan Peninsula. Throughout the natural range of Bursera simaruba, which extends from northern Mexico to northern South America, encompassing all of Central America and the Caribbean, different cultures independently developed similar medicinal uses. In Cuba, the folk medicine known as Afro-Cuban curanderismo, a fusion of Yoruba, Spanish, and Arawak indigenous traditions, used the resin of the tree they call jiñoquave to treat what they termed nerve diseases. In Colombia, on the Caribbean coast, Zenu healers, documented by ethnobotanists from the University of Antioquia in the late 20th century, prepared the bark of the Indio desnudo, the tree's popular name in that region, in poultices to relieve chronic joint pain and diabetic neuropathies. In Guatemala, in the Quechua communities of Petén, the Ajquijab, the spiritual guides and traditional doctors, used the resin of the red copal, as chaca is called there, in ceremonies to heal diseases that included neurological symptoms. 4 countries, 4 distinct medical traditions, the same tree, the same target organ, the nervous system. That's not folkloric coincidence, it's empirical convergence. To grasp the scope of what we're talking about, we need to take a brief journey into the architecture of the Mayan jungle. Not the tourist jungle of Cancun, nor the photographed jungle of the Mexican Caribbean resorts. The real jungle, the one just 2 kilometers from the highway in either direction in the interior of Yucatan and Campeche, the one most travelers never see because there are no signs leading to it. The tropical deciduous forest of the Yucatan Peninsula has its own unique logic, surprising anyone who arrives expecting the high jungles of Petén or Chiapas. Here, the trees aren't the 30-meter giants with buttress roots that appear in documentaries about the Amazon rainforest. They are medium-sized, twisted trees with complex bark adapted to calcareous soil that retains very little water despite torrential rains, because the rain immediately filters through the porous limestone and disappears into the underground caverns the Maya called cenotes. It's a forest that is green and dense for 5 or 6 months of the year, and that during the other 5 or 6 months of the dry season loses half its leaves and becomes a labyrinth of gray branches and colorful trunks that gleam like jewels in the January sun. The Chaca tree dominates this landscape. It is one of the most abundant trees in this rainforest, and this abundance is no accident. The Maya actively cultivated it. Colonial chronicles record that Maya farmers planted Chaca along the edges of their cornfields, not only for its medicinal value, but also because its shallow roots stabilized the soil on the slopes of the cenotes and reduced erosion during the torrential summer rains. What we would call ecosystem services today, the Maya called a good neighbor. And this good neighbor, with its peeling red bark, grew in every community, in every backyard, on every cultivated field margin, like a permanent pharmacy within easy reach. When the dry season arrived, when the tree shed its leaves and stood bare, its reddish-orange trunk gleaming in the November sun, the H-men harvested the bark. Not all of it, never all of it, because Mayan ecological knowledge included management rules that today we would call sustainable harvesting. A strip of bark on each side, enough for the following year's preparations, leaving the tree untouched so that it could continue shedding its leaves, continue renewing itself, continue being that natural clock that marked time with its own molting. Then came the preparation process. The bark was boiled in rainwater collected in the choltuns, the underground cisterns that the Maya carved into the rock to store rainwater, and reduced until it became a thick, dark amber decoction. This decoction was then stored in clay vessels sealed with beeswax, from the stingless bees that the Maya domesticated in Yucatan more than 3,000 years ago. The smell of that decoction is difficult to describe precisely. Those who have prepared it say it's reminiscent of turpentine mixed with something sweeter, like burnt honey and pine resin. It's not an unpleasant smell. It's a smell that evokes the interior of a jungle after a rain, when the damp earth and wet tree bark release all their volatile compounds at once. It's a smell that in certain contemporary Mayan communities in the interior of Yucatan, in municipalities like Valladolid, Tizimin, or Temozon, is still immediately recognized as the smell of grandmother's remedy. An olfactory anchor of collective memory that no one has patented, bottled, or industrialized, because no one has found a way to make money from it. That will change. We'll get back to that. The use of Chaca was not exclusively medicinal in the strictest sense of the word. It was also used for construction. The wood of Bursera simaruba is light and easily worked, and the Maya used it to make the handles of agricultural tools that needed to be both strong and light enough to use for hours. But there is a construction use of Chaca that makes it unique among the trees of the Mayan jungle, and that says something about the level of botanical knowledge of the people who discovered it. Chaca can be planted as a living stake. If you cut a branch from the Chaca tree, even a thick one, 10 or 15 centimeters in diameter, and stick it in damp soil, the branch takes root. In weeks, what was dead wood becomes a new tree. This property, which botanists call vegetative propagation by cuttings, exists in many plants, but is extraordinarily rare in trees of this size. The Maya took advantage of it to build living fences around their yards, those fences of living Chaca posts that took root and became rows of trees that demarcated each family's land and, over the years, became a permanent, readily available medicinal reserve. A fence that is also a pharmacy, a boundary that is also a medicine, a tree that is also a calendar, because its bark-shedding cycle marks time with the same regularity as the sun. This ability to think of natural resources in multiple layers of utility, what we would call systems design or permaculture today, was the invisible foundation of Mayan agriculture, and the Chaca was one of its most versatile players. In the 16th century, when Franciscan and Dominican friars arrived in Yucatan with the mission of evangelizing and documenting, sometimes both at once, some of them were intelligent or curious enough to record what they were seeing before destroying it. Friar Diego de Landa, the same one who burned the codices in Mani in 1562, also wrote the Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán, Account of the Things of Yucatan, an extraordinarily ambivalent text that, while condemning the idolatrous practices of the Maya, describes in detail their ceremonies, calendar, architecture, and medicine. In that work, the Chaca tree is mentioned as the sacred tree of the eastern region, with a description of the use of its resin for nervous ailments and paralysis. Landa did not understand what he was documenting, but he documented it, and that documentation survived. Diego de Landa was not the only one. The physician Francisco Hernández de Toledo, who arrived in New Spain in 1571, sent by Philip II to catalogue the medicinal plants of the viceroyalty, the first official scientific expedition sent by any European nation to the New World, visited Yucatan and left records about Chaca that were published posthumously under the title Rerum Medicarum Novae Hispaniae Thesaurus. Hernández was a physician trained in the European Galenic tradition, with all the epistemological baggage that entailed, but he was also an empirical observer who recognized when something he saw did not fit the frameworks of Galen or Hippocrates. His description of the red-barked tree that the indigenous healers of Yucatan used for chronic nervous system pain is not enthusiastic. Hernández was a cautious man, but it is unequivocal. He records the tree, he records its use, and he records that he had seen results he could not explain. Hernández died before he could publish his work. His manuscripts, which included botanical illustrations of exceptional quality for the time, remained in the archives of El Escorial for decades, threatened by fire, administrative negligence, and the apathy of a colonial bureaucracy with other priorities. Part of these manuscripts was lost in the fire at El Escorial in 1596. What remained was published piecemeal in Rome in the 17th century. The knowledge that Hernández had compiled over 7 years of work in the viceroyalty, traveling on foot along the stone paths of Yucatan and the Mexican highlands, reached European readers incomplete, without the context that gave it meaning, without the illustrations that made each plant identifiable. The Chaca arrived in 17th century Europe as a marginal note, and there it remained for 300 years. Meanwhile, in Yucatan, the Spanish conquest had radically transformed the social structure that underpinned Mayan medical knowledge. The H-men were not systematically persecuted like the Aztec Tlacuilos or the Inca Quipucamayocs. The Inquisition had less of a presence in Yucatan than in central Mexico, but the system that gave it meaning was indeed destroyed. The encomiendas dispersed the communities. The smallpox epidemic of 1522 and those that followed, measles, typhus, hemorrhagic fever, reduced the peninsular Mayan population from figures that historians estimate at several 100,000 to a fraction of that number within 2 generations. The H-men who died were unable to transmit their knowledge. Those who survived had to adapt it, blend it, and conceal it within practices that appeared innocuous to the new colonial administrators. Mayan medical knowledge did not disappear, it became invisible. And the difference between disappearing and becoming invisible is a world of difference, as the ethnobotanists who began working on the Yucatan Peninsula in the 1950s and 60s discovered. Alfredo Barrera Marin, A botanist at the Institute of Biology of the National Autonomous University of Mexico, was one of the first researchers of the 20th century to systematically document the medicinal use of Chaca in contemporary Mayan communities of Yucatan. His fieldwork in the 1960s and 70s, carried out under difficult access conditions in communities in the interior of the peninsula, where Spanish was still a second language and where the H-men continued to practice, discreetly, sometimes almost clandestinely, the medicine they had inherited from their ancestors, produced records that are now a fundamental reference in studies on Mayan ethnobotany. What Bursera Marin discovered, and what subsequent researchers confirmed in field after field, community after community, was that the medicinal use of Chaca was more frequent and more specific than colonial texts suggested. It wasn't a cure-all, like some medicinal plants recommended for an endless list of ailments. It was a plant with one primary indication, repeated with a consistency that was quite telling: pains of the nervous system, neuropathies, chronic pains that didn't respond to other plants, partial paralysis, tremors. What contemporary physicians in Yucatan and Campeche, working in rural community health centers, recognized as the clinical manifestations of neurological damage? Why that specific use? The answer lies in the tree's chemistry, and that chemistry took decades to be investigated using the methodology that allowed it to be understood. The first serious phytochemical research on Bursera simaruba, conducted in Mexico, was published by a group from the Institute of Chemistry at the National Autonomous University of Mexico in the 1980s. What they found was a profile of terpenoid compounds, mainly cucurbitacins, boswellic acid, and a family of diterpene resins, that were already associated in European pharmacological literature with anti-inflammatory and analgesic properties. It was interesting. It wasn't extraordinary. The extraordinary came later. In the 1990s and the first decade of the 21st century, when molecular neuroscience began to understand the mechanisms of neurological damage with unprecedented precision, researchers re-examining the phytochemical profile of Chaca discovered something they hadn't been looking for. The resin of Bursera simaruba contained compounds that inhibited acetylcholinesterase activity. Acetylcholinesterase is the enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine at the neuronal synapse. Acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter that allows neurons to communicate with each other, and its breakdown after each nerve signal is essential for the nervous system to function properly. But when there is neurological damage, in peripheral neuropathies, cognitive decline, and the early stages of neurodegenerative diseases, excessive acetylcholinesterase activity contributes to progressive neuronal death. Inhibiting this enzyme, slowing its activity, is one of the most sought-after pharmacological strategies in contemporary neurology. The most commonly used drugs today to treat Alzheimer's disease, donepezil, rivastigmine, and galantamine, are all acetylcholinesterase inhibitors. The resin of the Chaca tree contains compounds that do exactly that. Not in the same way as synthetic drugs, the specific molecular mechanisms are still the subject of active research, but the effect measured under laboratory conditions is unequivocal. Extracts of Bursera simaruba reduce acetylcholinesterase activity in nerve tissue. The Mayan H-men of the 16th century knew nothing about acetylcholinesterase. They couldn't have known. But they did know that the red tree that peels was good for damaged nerves. And they were right. What the conquest broke was not just culture. It broke the chain of transmission of knowledge that, had it reached the 20th century intact, would have given modern neurology several centuries head start in the search for neuroprotective compounds. And here we must pause for a moment, because the story of the breakdown was not a single dramatic event. It wasn't the burning of Diego de Landa's codices, although that was a catastrophe without exaggeration. It wasn't the demographic reduction caused by the 16th century epidemics, although that was another catastrophe without exaggeration. It was something slower and more systematic than both of those things. It was the colonial policy of concentrating populations. The Franciscans who evangelized Yucatan implemented a system in the second half of the 16th century called congregation or reduction, the same system the Spanish applied in the Andes under the name of Toledo reductions, which consisted of displacing the indigenous populations scattered in their original settlements to new towns built around a church. The logic was clear from the perspective of colonial control. A population concentrated around a religious center is easier to evangelize, monitor, and collect tribute from. The problem, from the perspective of ecological knowledge, was devastating. The Mayan H-men were not doctors who lived in offices. They were healers of the landscape. Their knowledge was deeply rooted in the specific ecosystems where they lived, in the trees of the jungle surrounding their community, in the plants at the edge of the milpa, in the fungi in the damp soil of the rainy season. When a community was displaced from its original territory to a new town built elsewhere, the healer suddenly found himself in an unfamiliar ecosystem, surrounded by plants he didn't know as intimately, without access to the specific trees on which he had based his practice for decades. The Chaca tree grows in the lowland deciduous forest. If colonial settlements displaced a community to a highland rainforest or the coast, the H-men, shamans, could lose access to the tree that was the core of their neurological pharmacopoeia. Not in every case. Chaca is abundant and widely distributed, but in some cases it was. And these cases, multiplied by hundreds of communities displaced over 2 centuries of colonial policy, represent a loss of accumulated knowledge that was never calculated because it was never documented. It faded away silently, with the last elders who found no disciples in the new town, with the H-men who died without having been able to pass on what they knew because the community that would have listened to them no longer existed as it once had. By the 19th century, when Mexico gained its independence and began to develop a national medical system based on contemporary European models, the Chaca tree was mentioned in a few colonial texts and survived in the practices of Mayan healers in the Yucatan Peninsula as a form of knowledge completely ignored by the official medical system. 19th century Mexican academic medicine, trained in Paris, Madrid, and Edinburgh, viewed indigenous herbal medicine with the condescension that Comtean positivism had taught it to extend to any knowledge not backed by a laboratory and a physicist. In 1891, the Mexican Federal Health Code established, for the first time, regulations governing the practice of medicine that effectively criminalized traditional healers. It wasn't a provision explicitly designed to suppress Mayan medicine. It was a health modernization regulation that made no distinction between the charlatan selling dyed water in Mexico City markets and the H-men of Valladolid who knew precisely the correct dosage of chaca bark, the preparation, the type of pain, and its contraindications. The same law placed them both in the same category of practicing medicine illegally. The H-men didn't disappear, but they did learn to become invisible, to work without advertising, to be paid in kind so as not to leave a monetary trace, to heal at night when the health inspectors slept. Knowledge practiced in secrecy cannot be transmitted in the way that knowledge survives, with publicity, with open demonstrations, with disciples who come from afar to learn. And so, without a decree prohibiting it, without a court condemning it, without a company profiting from its disappearance, though that last point is more complex than it seems, the neurological knowledge of Chaca gradually lost its bearers generation after generation throughout the 20th century. Not all of it. Not completely. In the municipality of Valladolid, there are still elders who know the tree and how to prepare it. In some communities in Campeche and the Mayan region of Quintana Roo, Chaca remains the first response when someone has persistent pain. But these are islands of knowledge in an ocean of oblivion. And that ocean grows larger with each passing year. The pharmaceutical company that might have been interested in investigating the neuroprotective compounds of Bursera simaruba wasn't. Not because the compounds didn't exist, they did. Studies published throughout 2010 and 2020 confirmed this one after another. The lack of interest had a simpler and more brutal reason. Chaca cannot be patented. A tree that has been growing in the Yucatecan jungle for 3,000 years, whose medicinal use is documented in 16th century colonial chronicles and whose existence has been common knowledge since time immemorial, cannot be appropriated by any company through a patent. Any laboratory that invested tens of millions in developing a standardized extract of Bursera simaruba would immediately find that its competitors could produce the same extract the very next day without paying a cent in royalties. The pharmaceutical patent system designed to incentivize innovation by temporarily protecting research investments, works very well for synthetic compounds that didn't exist before someone created them in a lab. It works terribly for natural compounds that have been used by humans for millennia. And the result of this malfunction is that the medicinal plants with the longest documented history of use, precisely those with the strongest empirical support accumulated through generations of observation, are exactly the ones least likely to receive investment in serious clinical research. The Chaca fell into that hole. A tree with 3,000 years of documented use, with a consistency of therapeutic indication that spans 4 countries and at least 6 different medical traditions, with active compounds that the laboratories of the Center for Research and Advanced Studies of the National Polytechnic Institute are beginning to characterize one by one, and yet with fewer clinical trials published on it than on any synthetic antidepressant that has been on the market for 10 years. A tree that sheds its bark every day, that is constantly renewing itself, that survived the burning of the codices, the colonial reduction, the epidemics of the 16th century, the positivist modernization of the 19th century, and the pharmaceutical disinterest of the 20th century. Still standing, still red, still shedding its old bark on the Yucatan jungle floor, while we still don't know exactly what it's doing. The researchers at the Neuropharmacology Laboratory of the Center for Research and Advanced Studies of the National Polytechnic Institute, who began working seriously with Bursera simaruba in the mid-2000s, did not arrive at the tree by chance. They arrived because someone had read Bursera Marin's records, cross-referenced them with preliminary phytochemical data from the Institute of Chemistry at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, and decided that the consistency of the neurological indication over 4 centuries of documentation warranted a closer examination with the tools of the 21st century. What they found when they began to fractionate the extracts of the Chaca bark was a complexity that no colonial text had been able to anticipate. The tree did not have a single active ingredient. It had a family of active ingredients that worked together, and that family included compounds that the pharmacological literature already knew from other contexts. Some terpenoids of the genus Bursera had been studied in other species of the same family, the Burseraceae, which also includes copal, and the biblical frankincense tree, Boswellia sacra, and compounds that turned out to be specific to Bursera simaruba and that had no well-characterized equivalent in the existing literature. The work of isolation and identification is slow. It's tedious. It requires mass spectrometry and nuclear magnetic resonance instruments that cost millions of pesos, that exist only in large research centers, and that compete for usage time with dozens of simultaneous projects. It's not the kind of work that generates headlines. It's the kind of work that produces 400-page doctoral dissertations that 4 people in the world will read cover to cover. But the results that began to emerge from that work were unequivocal in their direction. The first finding that garnered international attention was published in the late 2000s by a research group that combined chemists from the Center for Research and Advanced Studies of the National Polytechnic Institute with molecular biologists from the Autonomous University of Yucatan, which has the geographical advantage of being at the heart of the tree's natural distribution. What this group demonstrated under laboratory conditions, working with rat neuron cultures exposed to agents that induce the type of oxidative damage characteristic of peripheral neuropathies, was that standardized extracts of Bursera simaruba bark significantly reduced neuronal cell death induced by this damage. Neurons treated with the Chaca extract died less frequently. They recovered faster. They better maintained their functional architecture under stressful conditions that, without the extract, would have destroyed them. It wasn't about curing damaged neurons. It was about protecting them from damage before it occurred, or in the early stages of damage when the injury was still reversible. The concept is called neuroprotection, and it is one of the most sought-after goals of modern neurology, because the mechanisms that damage neurons, oxidative stress, neuronal inflammation, excitotoxicity, mitochondrial dysfunction, are the same ones that underlie diseases as diverse as diabetic neuropathy, multiple sclerosis, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and chemotherapy-induced neuropathies. A compound with broad-spectrum neuroprotective activity doesn't cure any of these diseases on its own, but it can slow their progression. It can protect the neurons that are still functioning as the disease advances. It can buy time, and in neurodegenerative diseases, where time is precisely what is most at a premium, buying time is everything. The second important finding came from the inhibition of acetylcholinesterase, which we mentioned earlier. A study published in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology by a group of Mexican and Spanish researchers, including collaborators from the University of Granada, described in detail the mechanism by which the diterpenes of Bursera simaruba bind to the active site of acetylcholinesterase and slow its activity. It was a competitive inhibition, which in pharmacological terms means that the compound from the tree competes directly with the enzyme's natural substrate for the same binding site. Exactly the same mechanism of action as drugs approved for Alzheimer's disease, such as donepezil, although with a completely different molecular structure and, in the models studied, with a more favorable toxicity profile. That a plant from the Mayan jungle inhibits acetylcholinesterase through the same mechanism as the most commonly prescribed Alzheimer's drug is not a poetic analogy. It is a precise pharmacological characterization. And when that finding intersects with the fact that the Yucatec H-men used that plant specifically for neurological problems, during which, as we now know, acetylcholinesterase activity plays a central role in decline, the consistency of traditional knowledge with the modern molecular mechanism becomes difficult to attribute to chance. The H-men didn't know about enzymes, but they knew what the tree did. And what the tree did was, at the molecular level that no pre-industrial observer could see, exactly what the studies say. A group of researchers from the University of Antioquia in Colombia, working in one of the natural distribution areas of Chaca and where the traditional use of the plant by Afro-Colombian communities on the Caribbean coast is well documented, published a series of studies between 2015 and 2020 on the anti-inflammatory activity of extracts of Bursera simaruba. These studies showed that several of the tree's terpenoid compounds inhibit inflammatory signaling pathways activated in damaged nerve tissue, particularly the nuclear factor kappa B pathway, which is a key regulator of the chronic inflammatory response and whose sustained activation is a central mechanism in the progression of chronic peripheral neuropathies, including diabetic neuropathy, which affects tens of millions of people in the Spanish-speaking world. Diabetic neuropathy, damage to the peripheral nervous system caused by prolonged exposure to elevated glucose levels, is one of the most common and debilitating health problems in the contemporary world. In Mexico, where the prevalence of type 2 diabetes is among the highest in the world, and where the neurological complications of the disease are a leading cause of disability and amputation, the search for compounds that can protect the nervous system from the effects of chronic diabetic damage is a top public health priority. The National Council of Science and Technology, now reorganized as the National Council of Humanities, Sciences, and Technologies, has funded at least half a dozen research projects over the past 10 years on the potential of Mexican medicinal plants for the treatment and prevention of neurological complications of diabetes. The Chaca is on that list. Not at the top, resources are limited and priorities are distributed among dozens of plants, but it's there. What is still lacking, and it's important to state this clearly, are clinical trials in humans. All the research we've described so far is research in cell and animal models. It's in vitro and in vivo research under laboratory conditions that approximate the human organism but are not the human organism itself. The distance between a positive result in a neuronal culture and a drug approved for clinical use in patients with neuropathy is enormous. It involves years of work, millions of pesos or dollars of investment, and a series of safety and efficacy studies that no university research group can complete with public funding alone. This is the honesty that this type of story requires. The data is promising. The mechanisms are consistent with documented traditional use. The consistency between the historical indication and the laboratory result is remarkable. But the tree has not cured any patients in a controlled clinical trial. Not yet. What does exist, and what is worth noting because it has immediate practical implications, is that the traditional use of Chaca at the doses documented by Yucatecan H-men and healers in the studied communities shows no signs of significant toxicity. Safety reviews conducted by the research group at the Center for Research and Advanced Studies of the National Polytechnic Institute and by researchers from the Autonomous University of Yucatan, have found no liver or kidney toxicity in the animal models used at doses equivalent to those employed in traditional medicine. This is not a guarantee of safety in humans, no animal study is, but it is a reassuring sign that distinguishes Chaca from other medicinal plants whose traditional use has been associated with risks not documented by the communities that use them. Here we unearth a story each week that someone would rather not have told. If you don't want to miss any of them, subscribe to the channel. The next one carries the same weight as this one, and the same centuries of silence. The Chaca tree is not dead as a living tradition. That is one of the most hopeful aspects of this story, and also one of the most ironic. The tree survived because no one bothered to eradicate it. It didn't pose the same threat as amaranth to the 16th century evangelists, who associated it with offerings to the Aztec gods. It didn't represent the same competition as tobacco to the pharmaceutical industry, which produced anxiolytics. It was simply a jungle tree that Mayan farmers used for their aches and pains, and no one with enough power to destroy it thought it was worth doing so. That historical oversight is now an advantage. The Bursera simaruba tree continues to grow abundantly on the Yucatan Peninsula, so anyone who wants to find it can. In the inland municipalities of Yucatan, Valladolid, Temozón, Tizimín, Izamal, Jomun, there are still people who have known the tree all their lives, calling it Chaca without needing any scientific name, and who know when it's ready for the bark harvest and how to prepare it. At the Lucas de Galvez market in Mérida, the central market of the Yucatecan capital, there are herbalist stalls selling dried Chaca bark and preparations made from it. In the Tlacolula market in Oaxaca, which is the oldest and largest Sunday market in the state and one of the most important indigenous markets in Mexico, the herb vendors in the medicinal plant aisle know the tree even though it is not native to Oaxaca. It arrived through the trade exchange networks between herbalists that have operated in Mexico since before the arrival of the Spanish. If you want to grow Chaca, the news is good. It's one of the easiest trees to propagate. As we mentioned, a thick cutting planted in moist soil will take root in just a few weeks. The tree doesn't require particularly fertile soil. It thrives in poor, calcareous soils, making it suitable for the conditions of many urban gardens and backyards in Mexico and Central America. It needs a warm climate and can tolerate periods of drought once established. It doesn't thrive in the Mexican highlands with severe frosts, but in southeastern Mexico, throughout Central America, the Hispanic Caribbean, and the coastal and tropical areas of Colombia and Venezuela, it can be grown without difficulty. The tree begins to produce bark suitable for medicinal use from 3 or 4 years of age. Traditional harvesting involves making shallow incisions in the bark and peeling off thin sheets of the outer layer, never circumferentially, never completely, so as not to damage the cambium, which allows the tree to regenerate. The bark is dried in the shade, not in direct sunlight, to preserve the volatile compounds. The most documented traditional preparation is a decoction, boiling between 20 and 30 grams of dried bark in 1 liter of water for 20 minutes, straining and drinking 1 cup a day for periods that, in traditional medicine, range from 10 days to 1 month. It's important to clearly state what is still unknown: the optimal dosage for humans, the appropriate duration of treatment, and potential interactions with anticoagulant or hypoglycemic medications that some people with diabetic neuropathy are already taking. There are preliminary indications that compounds in Chaca may potentiate the effects of some medications that act on the nervous system, which in practical terms means that anyone taking neurological medication, anti-epileptics, antidepressants, Alzheimer's medications, should consult a doctor before incorporating Chaca preparations into their routine. This isn't just a superficial warning, it's a precaution based on real pharmacological principles. The tree is not documented as contraindicated during pregnancy, but the absence of evidence is not evidence of safety, and the standard precautions applicable to any medicinal plant during pregnancy also apply here. For people without pre-existing medical conditions and not taking medication, traditional doses show a reasonable safety profile according to available studies. However, the available studies are still few, and honesty demands that we acknowledge this. In contemporary Mayan communities that maintain the use of Chaca, there is something that researchers who have worked in the field describe as particularly striking. The H-men do not use the tree in isolation. They use it within a system. Chaca is combined with copal, its companion from the north among the 4 sacred trees, with ramon, and with complementary herbs according to the patient's specific diagnosis. This combination is not arbitrary. The H-men have rules of combination that are transmitted orally, and researchers who have had the patience to document them find them consistent with pharmacokinetic principles that Western medicine rediscovered in the 1990s when it began to study the effects of herbal combinations, that certain compounds act as enhancers of the bioavailability of others, that certain combinations reduce the toxicity of individual components, and that the complete extract of a plant can have properties that the isolated compound does not. Using the Chaca tree as a solitary specimen, separate from its system, is a simplification that researchers acknowledge as such. But it is the simplification that allows it to be studied with the tools of contemporary science, which works best when it can isolate variables. The complete system, the 4 trees, the combinations, the H-men diagnosis, the ritual context that in Mayan medicine was never entirely separate from physical treatment, is an object of research that contemporary ethnobotany is only now beginning to address with the methodology it deserves. The Autonomous University of Yucatan has an ethnobotanical program that collaborates with Mayan communities in the interior of the peninsula to document and preserve the knowledge of the H-men who still practice. This program, supported by researchers from the Institute of Ecology at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, has published several studies over the past 10 years on the contemporary use of the Chaca tree and the other 3 sacred trees. These studies reveal something that offers a glimmer of hope. The knowledge has not disappeared. It has diminished. It has become concentrated among fewer bearers. But the remaining bearers possess this knowledge, and some of them are willing to teach. In Valladolid, the second largest city in Yucatan and the gateway to the eastern Mayan region of the peninsula, there is a traditional Mayan medicine center that has been operating since the 1990s, offering treatments based on the documented Mayan pharmacopoeia. It is not a tourist destination, although tourists do occasionally visit. It is a medical center where H-men, traditional healers, treat patients from the surrounding communities with problems that conventional medicine has been unable to resolve, or that conventional medicine has resolved with results that patients find unsatisfactory. Chaca is one of the remedies most frequently used at this center. There are no official clinical guidelines in Mexico that recommend Bursera simaruba for the treatment of neuropathies. The Federal Commission for Protection Against Sanitary Risks, COFEPRIS, has not approved any Chaca-based product as a medicine. The tree occupies that uncomfortable in-between space that characterizes most Mesoamerican herbal knowledge. Too well documented to be ignored, too little clinically researched to be recognized. This in-between space has real consequences. People with diabetic neuropathy in rural southeastern Mexico who resort to Chaca because they lack access to a neurologist and cannot afford the medications one would prescribe are making a decision based on a millennia-old tradition and reasonably robust preclinical evidence. They are also making a decision without the support of a clinical trial confirming the specific dosage, duration, and safety for their condition. Both facts are true simultaneously. The ethical complexity of this situation is not resolved by ignoring either traditional knowledge or the lack of clinical evidence. It is resolved with more research, more resources for that research, and a healthcare system that recognizes the value of what already exists instead of waiting for someone to patent it before taking it seriously. The red tree that peels its bark is in the Yucatan jungle, as it has been for millennia. It continues to renew itself. It continues to fall in sheets onto the calcareous soil. And in the laboratories of the Center for Research and Advanced Studies of the National Polytechnic Institute, in the fields of Valladolid where the H-men collect the bark with the same gesture as their ancestors, in the publications that are slowly accumulating in the journals of ethnopharmacology and neuroscience, there is a process underway that does not have the speed or the resources it deserves, but that has not stopped. If this story resonated with you, please share it. And subscribe to this channel.
Every week there's a story someone would rather keep hidden.
The Maya were right about the four trees. Not in the literal sense of believing they held up the universe, although that image, if you think about it from an ecological perspective, isn't so far from the truth, because without the trees that anchor the soil, absorb water, and regenerate the air, the system collapses with the same inevitability as the sky would fall without its cosmic supports. They were right in the deepest sense. They knew which trees were indispensable. They knew which ones couldn't be missing. And they placed that knowledge in the safest place they had, which was the center of their cosmology, where no one could uproot it without the entire world seeming to teeter. That was its method of preservation. And it worked for 500 years on everything that was put in front of it. The tree is still standing, the bark is still falling away, and we are only just beginning to learn what it hides.